Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our short series of myth-busting shows. Some of the myths have been absolutely easy, kind of black and white to delineate. Some have been more confused in that there has been a basis to the myth. But today, kind of a big one, but we're condensing it down to 10 minutes. And we are talking about just how close was Operation Barbarossa to defeating Stalin's forces. Well, regular guest and sidebar warrior Grant is back to discuss this. He is the author of Romania's Holy War, which I'm holding up a copy of. Links are in the description below. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Grant. How are you today?
Oh, good. Taking off a little bit of work to do something more fun.
Good.
So, thanks for having me, Paul. Mentioning that, I do have to say, disclaimer, these are my own opinions and do not represent the positions of the U.S. Army, Department of Defense, or U.S. government. So just that
disclaimer done. And we're just talking before going live. Tackling Operation Barbarossa in 10 minutes or 15 minutes is quite a challenge. But the point is to debunk this idea that it was really, really close to succeeding. So you come with a PowerPoint. I'll nudge on the slides. You know the score, folks. You've watched these before. There may be time for a couple of questions at the end. Doesn't mean we don't welcome your comments, but basically it's a chance for our guest to present his case, and then we'll see what time we have at the end. So over to you, Grant.
All right. I guess let's get into it. Hit the first slide. All right, I think really to stop really quick, what exactly is Operation Barbarossa? I mean, there's some that talk very narrowly, right? That it's the legit operation. You know, there is two operations, Operation Barbarossa, then Typhoon's launch in October, so spoilers alert, if Operation Barbarossa was so successful, why is there an Operation Typhoon? But, so we have that. We also have people talking about it for the campaign in 1941. So that's the shorthand. And that's where we were going to go with it. But other people, I mean, you can see there, some people use Operation Barbarossa for the entire conflict. I think it's because of this sexy name, Barbarossa. Hitler chose it. He was onto something there. It's still going down well. But so tonight or this afternoon, we're kind of talking about Barbarossa in this kind of as a shorthand for the entire 1941 campaign, which is including Barbarossa and Typhoon. And so, yeah, the myth, let's just get into it. The myth is, that the Germans came within a hair's breadth of Moscow. You have German soldiers being able to see the towers of the Kremlin in the distance, and they were that close. The Soviets were about to collapse. And this is just completely wrong. It's this over-focus on proximity. The other thing that gets on is the casualties, which are immense. The Soviets take millions of men killed and captured. It's astounding when you look at the numbers and you see these huge encirclement battles at Smolensk and Kiev, smaller ones in Uman, and it just and the thing is, this was used at the time. So once again, it's problematic when you're basically repeating the German propaganda. Yeah. Every few weeks, look at these huge numbers, all these captured things. Like, that should make us pause and think, wait a minute, there might be something bigger going on here. Also in this myth is kind of Hitler's blunder, right? There's this myth that, like, if only the Germans had kept going, if Hitler hadn't listened, if he'd listened to his generals, gone straight on from Moscow, hadn't turned, wasted time going to south into to Ukraine, or trying to get a bit more of, in the north, that, the German generals would have done it. And so this is another part of the myth. Also, there's this myth of kind of the delayed start, right? That, Operation Barbarossa was supposed to start in like the end of May, not the end of June. If they had launched it 4 weeks earlier, they would have been, and that's, again, it completely ignores, like, just if you launched something 4 weeks earlier, they weren't going to get 4 weeks farther in territory. Like, it wasn't going to be like, they would have gotten Moscow and then been farther where they wanted. That ignores everything that happens in between. It also ignores the fact that they couldn't have started earlier. It's most likely because of the late thaw, right? The Germans were watching the weather. They didn't want to be in the mud, unlike Putin, more recently. So they would have had to delay it anyway, and there's also logistical snarls. It would have just taken more time, probably. They probably weren't going to be able to launch it until at that time anyway. And then the final myth is the reason for, right, the German defeat is, again, it's not the German army, it's not the goals, it's the Rasputitsa, the mud in the fall, it's the Russian winter, right? Ignoring the fact that, like, it was muddy and cold for the Soviets as well, ignoring this whole bunch of things. But that's kind of once again this kind of German generals, and also at the time, if wartime propaganda, they're talking about general winter. The Germans are saying, "Oh, it's just the winter. We'll be back in the summertime." Right? This is the myth. Let's move on. Now, the reality is just that. Actually, go back really quick. The one thing I want to point out for the other, I've chose this map in part because it included the minor Axis nations there, Romania, Hungary. The thing that makes me a little mad about this map is they don't have Finland in there because for some ridiculous reason they're not counting them as a co-belligerent of the Axis. So another myth there is that the continuation war and Finland kind of, we were fighting our own separate war in this whole thing, right? But they were, Finland's there too, and I think that's something also important to point out, right? You're not just the Germans, you got all these other groups in getting involved, and they're going to kind of pop back up in a little bit too. All right. Now the reality is, it's just this was pretty much doomed militarily from the outset, and I think I kind of pulled them out. A lot of people have written on this, David Glantz and everything, but like recently, the person who's really gotten into this, David Stale, and I recommend these books. They're very readable, but like one on Barbarossa, you have Kiev, then you have Typhoon, and you got Moscow. And this is only covering the main thrusts, mostly Army Group Center. One book is on Army Group South about the battle for Kiev. So he's really gotten into this and gotten into detail, 4 books that you could probably do more, but it just goes to I think it's important to point out, like when you get into the nitty gritty like this, he's going to show that really this thing had huge odds to ever succeed. And the odds were, really it was going to be because of a political collapse, not militarily. I mean, even during the wargaming before, logistically, they were wanting to get to Archangel Vogelline. Now, the Archangel, if you look on that map, you see the northern Dvina, right? The Archangel's at the mouth of that. So that line is way deep into there. But really, when they actually looked at the logistical support for their motorized troops and how far they could get before they would have to pause, it was the Dvina. The other it was the Western Dvina, the Dragovula. It's like something else in Lithuanian, and the Dnieper, right? I mean, you could see that on the map. That is not even all the way to Moscow, right? It's like you can't. So even with their logistical capability, they can't get in there. And I think this is a huge problem, and they just kind of hand wave it. Like, oh, well, we'll figure it out. But because the thing is, they're looking and thinking of 1917, 1918, right? If we can knock out the Russian army, the Soviet army in these border battles and crush it, that will have a political collapse. And then the rest of this thing is just going to be a railway war, right? That just like in 1918, where the Bolsheviks collapsed and we could just basically put troops on railways and they would just, the Germans just rode the railways, jumped out of the station, declared it, kind of captured, and then kept going, right? This is what they expected to happen. So so they kind of hand wave that, oh, well, by the time we get there, there won't be any much resistance and we can just kind of use captured railways and, it won't be a big issue. I mean, in Hitler, he thought himself that you'd be in Moscow by mid-August, right? And total victory by the start of October. I mean, and that's just, and that's, but in reality, you have beginning of static warfare in the end of July and a pause in early August, right? Then you have the turn south and to Kiev that kind of bashes, and because of Stalin's bad decisions, really damages the Red Army there, which then kind of allows and gives time for the Germans elsewhere to rebuild and then launch this Operation Typhoon in October. But they clearly already by July realize that Operation Barbarossa has failed. It has not even gotten close to getting to where it was supposed to be, and more importantly, Soviet resistance. But before I get there, but intelligence failure, this is a huge part of it. Like you have this small intelligence arm in the Wehrmacht that's running these things, and it is just completely misunderstands Soviet capabilities, the size of the Soviet force, tactical stuff like what kind of tanks they have and how many. It's run by like, I think the guy was like, kind of a drunken dilettante, if I'm remembering correctly, with a small staff who was also, in charge of looking up all the foreign armies east. And he completely, the intelligence is terrible. And, it misses the Soviet production. It misses Soviet patriotism and ideological commitment. There's this idea that they just kick in the door, destroy the Red Army in the border battles, and that's it. And it's completely wrong. I think this feeds into this is the Blitzkrieg myth. That we imagine the Wehrmacht going into Russia as this panzer motorized Luftwaffe supported thing. And the panzer motorized part is like 10, 15%, 20 if you're like counting every motorized unit, whereas you have mostly a World War I infantry artillery army, behind it. And so, these smaller, panzer spearheads, they can break through and go pretty dang far and do a lot of damage, but it means they're exposed. So even though that in like those casualties, the Germans are taking less, they're concentrated. They're concentrated on those elite formations. And it's not even just those being killed. Like, okay, then not that many are being killed, but tanks are breaking down. And that's a huge problem. So you're going to see that by the time you get to Moscow, your tank, your tank force of a Panzer division is like a handful of tanks, not because everyone's been knocked out, but some have just like had tracks fallen, engines fall apart. I mean, there's a huge like argument with Hitler and his generals talking about replacement engines, right? And like this is insane. This would be like FDR talking about replacement engines with like George C. Marshall or something like. But that's how like big of an issue logistically, and this kind of the problem that you have this two-tiered force, right? And that the smaller motorized panzer force is getting ground down and just falling apart, even if it's not only, and it's getting shot up too. You're losing those kind of experienced men that replacements can't really get. And then the big story here that is Soviet resistance, right? And everyone kind of one of the myths that used during propaganda, and still we can see it in like Enemy of the Gates, is that this is all coercion. That the polytroops, their political officers, they're just shooting these guys in the back with blocking battalions, which that's another myth. My PhD advisor kind of has busted that one. But really, I mean, there is coercion. That is an important part of it. It is a coercive state. But it's also people that still believe in, a lot of them still believe in communism, even those who have been roughly handled through the famine in the 30s and the purges as well. There's a lot of people that still believe that there will be, that there's, socialism and communism is still something worth fighting for. Plus you have all, kind of national Slavic kind of Great Mother Russia stuff coming up. And these guys fight. And we, a lot of these stories that like focus on the proximity, they ignore also the partisan movement. That tons of these soldiers are not being captured, not in these encirclements, and going into the hills or the woods or marshes and coming out and shooting up logistics, right? Which is exactly the biggest weak point of this German attack. And then finally, Soviet force generation, right? This is one of they are finding more men. And sure, these casualties, we don't want to say, oh, whatever. They have, the USSR did not have endless supplies of men. And these millions of men lost is a terrible blow to the Red Army. But the Red Army really never is close to collapse. Every time the Germans think this, they find a new army in the way. Sure, it might be a little less well-equipped and the men less well-trained, and those men will take more casualties, but there's always something there. And it's terrible, and, terrible losses. I don't want to just say like this was easy, but like realistically, the Germans just did not have the manpower, did not have the technical means to do what this insane plan was, because you had to knock out the Soviet Union in year one, or you're going to have this this battle turn into an attritional conflict, which it does. And once you get locked into that, and then Lend-Lease, which I I'm more skeptical of kind of crediting Lend-Lease to like some people just want to say, oh yeah, Lend-Lease, that's why they won. No, there's a lot more going on.
Yeah,
Lend-Lease isn't that big. It's important, but still, I mean, but once you get in, when you have other fronts opening up, and that's the other thing. A lot of people would like to treat this in kind of the abstract. Oh, Germany, Nazi Germany versus the USSR. But immediately the Brits are starting to get involved there, and they're already bombing. The Americans are getting, Hitler declares war on America. They're going to get involved. They're going to open up new fronts. You can't just put it in isolation that like, oh, now they grabbed all this territory, and it was kind of, oh, maybe it was going to be an equal fight. Well, no, not really. And plus, the Germans don't know how to manage what they've got, and they've murdered through starvation millions of Soviet prisoners of war who could be used for labor. But once again, these are Nazis. That wasn't ever the plan of kind of, oh, maybe next year. This was always supposed to, and it had to work in 41, and it didn't. I think, let's go to the next slide. One thing I want to point out is a good sign of how Barbarossa failed is how Nazi Germany, Hitler has to turn to his allies. Finland and Romania are the two main ones that they're in the planning from the get-go. And in the planning, they're not expected to do a lot because the Germans don't trust the Romanians to be able to do some of the stuff. Also, the Finns, I mean, they're kind of like, oh yeah, the Finns are pretty good, but they still understand there's limitations, and politically they don't want to be able to kind of give up some of these things and cede territory or whatever. But the Finns were not supposed to take Leningrad. They're supposed to help a little bit, and the Finns basically go to what they do. The Romanians were supposed to help a little bit, but they weren't supposed to go. They were past the Dnieper, and they weren't really supposed to go to Odessa by August. But end of July, when Operation Barbarossa is clearly shown to be failure, that Hitler goes hat in hand to these guys. The Finns are more reluctant. They go a little bit further, but not much, and they start demobilizing. Romanians go full in. They send an army to Odessa, which plays a big vital role in keeping things moving in Ukraine. They have another army that goes beyond the Dnieper. But I mean, they literally told the Romanian soldiers, hey, we're done. The Germans would say, thank you, Romanians. We don't need you anymore. And then all of a sudden the next week, actually, we're coming. And all of a sudden the Romanian soldiers are kind of complaining like, hey, we were just told we were going home. Or at best, we're just going to be sitting around here occupying southern Ukraine. Instead, they end up going all the way into Crimea. So, I mean, this is another sign here that people don't often talk about, that things have not gone well because all of a sudden these allies that weren't supposed to play a big role are being asked to do a lot more. So in conclusion, operational versus strategic. If you look narrowly operationally and look at these kind of prisoner of war numbers, Barbarossa is insane in what the Germans accomplished. But when you put it in perspective of what it was supposed to accomplish, and it was operations as strategy, right? In the Germans' view is basically, we're going to win this operation and that will solve our strategic problem. It didn't, right? They needed to knock it out in 41 in the USSR, and they didn't. I really do believe, I don't like, I know everyone doesn't like the words turning points, but I don't know if a single battle, whether the Battle of Moscow or Battle of Smolensk, is the turning point. But I think this campaign as a whole, this 4 or 5 months, and the fact that the Germans don't win it is a turning point in the war, because it's going to suck in the Wehrmacht and grind it down. And it's a huge front that allows, the Allies to be able to do a lot more things. And we just always have to remember that this terrible sacrifice the Soviets paid, it was not easy. We still have to remember that. We can't just write this off. Yeah, sure, it wasn't a near run thing, but it was a bloodily paid thing. And attritional conflict. After this German Barbarossa operation ends, it becomes one of this grinding attritional conflict. And with that, there you go. Myth busted.
Done. 19 minutes, 25 seconds, including my introduction. So good. We have time for just a couple of questions, but you have to be kind of speedy with your answers. So Phil Bosworth, I'm kind of wording it slightly differently. At the time, the British, the French, the US, they all thought that the Soviets would not be able to hold out. Communism was too deeply rooted. Does that affect the thinking post-war about Barbarossa? Because there was a perception amongst the Allies that the Soviets wouldn't hold out. It has also affected this idea that the Germans were closer to victory than they really were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like what journalism is the first draft of history. I mean, that really mean a lot of people at the time thought things were very, very close. I mean, we know now they weren't that close. But I think that, and then you have the German generals that come along, and you don't have the archives for a while, and the Soviets, and so they're privileged. And the Soviets have always questioned this German narrative, more German-centric narrative, and talked about, hey, yeah, like we suffered, but we destroy this thing, but they maybe underplay how much they suffered and overemphasize how many, or exaggerate the number of Germans they were facing. But that was kind of pushed because of the Cold War. It's like, oh, let's not listen to the Soviets. All their history is biased. And I think now in the times we've had 3 decades, we're getting to a point where we can see the reality of like, okay, the Soviet line is a little too far, but the German line is, especially the German generals, like it's completely ridiculous. This was never going to come off.
Okay, one more from Trevor Sheehan. Was the strategic surprise also a myth?
The
fact that the Soviets didn't know it was coming, I guess, basically.
No. I mean, yes and no, because I mean, if you read Jeffrey Roberts has written about this, he basically argues that Zhukov and the Red Army, they kind of expect, and there's like a quote that like Zhukov's like, hey, if they want to attack, let them come, we're ready. So Stalin plays a big role in like why they're not ready, but that is kind of a myth as well. Like the Soviets, they did think they did realize there was a massive buildup. They did realize there was a possibility. Stalin does play in that aspect, but there is a huge failure here on the Red Army's part, and that's easy. Then that's the other side, is blame Stalin, and we still do. Oh, it's the purges. Ignore the fact that lots of the officers actually weren't shot, ended up coming back. Ignore the fact that like my advisor's written a lot on this. It's more the fact that the Red Army had to like double then quadruple in size over a very short time, and it really wasn't. Its officers weren't as well trained. It wasn't as prepared as it thought it was.
Well, we will leave it there. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot more to discuss. People have brought up some amazing points and additional information in the sidebar there. And of course, I think if they were giving out world records for how quickly Operation Barbarossa can be discussed, I think we're on a chance of getting the gold medal day, because as you say, it's complex. It leads to typhoon, and people are asking about, when does Barbarossa become typhoon? Do they kind of morph into each other? Things like that. But we've done what we're supposed to do. We'll have you back on at some point in the future, Grant. It's always great talking to you, and I think nice job, well done. And there'll be people who will disagree with some of the conclusions, but there'll be people who agree with them. That is very much the point of these shows. So thanks very much, Grant. I'm back again with you all in 7 minutes time. Prit Buttar is on to talk about the myth of absolutely everything being Hitler's fault. Yes, a lot of tragic decisions were as a result of his meddling and ideology, but it wasn't all his fault. That's what we're talking about now. Next. So thank you very much, Grant. Thank you, viewers. See you in a few minutes. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.